Welcome, everyone. This is our first WEFI of the fall. Super happy to have everyone back. And for those of you who are new, welcome. We're going to be having Daniel present paper on self-employed mothers. Fabrizio is here in the chat as well. And then Elena will be discussing. So super happy to have everyone. Just to give an overview of the timeline, Daniel's going to talk for about 40 minutes. Then we'll have Elena, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. But if you have any questions throughout, what you can do is put them in the chat, and Daniel's co-author will be monitoring that, and we can have some questions throughout. So we'll try to make it as interactive as possible. And to that end, we would encourage everyone to put their cameras on if possible so that we can see everyone's happy faces.
So this is joint work with my wonderful co-author Fabrizio Core from Lewis University, and my name is Daniel Carpetti. I'm from Erasmus School of Economics. So today what I'm going to talk about is self-employed mothers, and more precisely how motherhood affects the earnings and the well-being of self-employed women, and more particularly how maternity benefit moderates this effect. So let me maybe just start by giving some motivating facts. Why should we even care about self-employed women, and particularly motherhood with respect to self-employed women? So let me start with the first observation about employment. If we look worldwide, what we can see is self-employment and small business ownership is a very important part of female employment. So worldwide, this is 46% of employment. If we look at OECD countries, or for example, the US or the European Union, this is a little bit lower, 16% in OECD, but it's still quite a sizable portion. So first fact, self-employment, very important for female employment. The second fact is self-employment is also often considered as a flexible employment alternative for mothers. So in this perspective, we are very much interested in whether this is the case. So how do self-employed mothers react to childbirth? Is it indeed a flexible employment alternative? How do their earnings change upon becoming mothers? And the third motivating factor I would like to mention is self-employment may also lead to incorporated entrepreneurship. So self-employment is often a precursor for entrepreneurship for larger firms that employ more people and are innovative. So if I look at just, I did a simple analysis in the Dutch data, we did an analysis, and we look at 3-year transition rates into incorporated entrepreneurship. And what we can see is that among self-employed women, this is approximately 6 times higher than among employees. So not all self-employed women might be considered entrepreneurs at the current moment, but there's a much higher transition rate compared to employees. So this motivates us to study how motherhood affects self-employed women and how maternity benefits can change this relationship. So you can think of many different questions in this aspect. We are going to focus on one particular group of self-employed women, and these are incumbent self-employed women. So in this paper, we are not studying transition into self-employment. We are studying women who are already self-employed. And what we are going to do, we look at 2 questions that has been widely studied in the labor and health literature regarding the motherhood for employees, regarding the effects of motherhood on employees. These questions, first is the so-called child penalty. This is the observation that motherhood decreases female employees' income relative to what fatherhood does to male employees' income. The second question we are going to study on self-employed women are the effects of maternity benefits. So we know from the huge labor literature that maternity benefits provide financial support for employees. They may improve their well-being and the well-being of their children, and they normally have little effect on long-term income. So we are also curious to know what are the effects of maternity benefits on self-employed mothers. So what do we expect to find if we take these 2 labor questions into the literature of self-employment and motherhood? Well, as a starting point, we know much less about these topics, so this is relatively under-researched. On the first question, how does childbirth affect self-employed women? Is, for example, the child penalty smaller? This is a little bit ambiguous theoretically. Let me explain why we think so. First of all, we know that self-employment is a flexible form of employment. So we might expect a lower child penalty for self-employed women. On the other hand, if the child penalty is due to preferences and employed women cannot easily adjust their hours, we might even find a higher child penalty for self-employed women. So there's an ambiguous relationship. What about job guarantees or maternity benefits? Well, if you look at self-employed women, what we can see is in many countries, their maternity benefits are either low or non-existent. So this might suggest that the child penalty is smaller for them. So this question remains an empirical exercise. Is there a child penalty in this group? On the second point, what's the effect of cash benefits? And we are going to particularly study a cash benefit that is unconditional on working. It's a maternity cash benefit. So self-employed women are going to receive an amount, and they are not required to work less during, for example, their pregnancy and afterwards. Now, here the key difference to employees is that self-employed women are not required to reduce their labor supply. So it's ambiguous whether they actually do reduce their labor supply, or, for example, they might also use this money to buy childcare, buy more childcare, and maybe potentially even increase how much they work. All right, so what do we find and what do we do in this paper? In this presentation, for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on the second set of questions. So these are the questions on the impacts of a maternity cash benefit. In the paper, we also study the child penalty. So let me just tell you about the child penalty, the main findings. So what we do, we have data from the Netherlands, administrative data, on the revenue and income of self-employed mothers, and we are going to explore what happens upon childbirth. What do we find is that in the quarter of childbirth, self-employed mothers experience a decline of 40% in business revenue. So this is on the intensive margin. And on the extensive margin, they are 13% less likely to have any business revenues. All right, so this is going to be relative to self-employed women not giving birth. This is in the quarter of the childbirth. What do we find in the long run? In the long run, what we find is that self-employed mothers suffer from a constant, a permanent child penalty because they are 6% less likely to generate any revenue, even 3 years after birth, and they are reporting 20% less revenues, lower revenues, if they have any. So what we document is that, yes, there is a child penalty for self-employed women. And what we also find is that for self-employed men, there is no such child penalty. So the findings from the labor literature on employees translate into this literature on self-employed mothers. Now, how do they compare to employees? Actually, what we find is that these effects are very similar. So almost identical effects on employees and identical effects as for self-employed mothers. So in the second part of the paper that I'm going to focus on today, we are going to study a maternity cash benefit, which is equivalent to 4 months of minimum wage, or in current euros, this is about 7,000 euros. So what do we find? We find that eligible self-employed women, so those women who can get this cash benefit, they are going to further decrease their business revenue by 7.5% in the first 2 years after childbirth. So as a baseline, think about the effect I presented on the previous slide. So they cut their business revenue by about 25% in the long run. So this 7.5% is on top of this cut. So it's a rather, we interpret this as a rather large effect of a relatively small cash benefit. What do we see? What happens to the household income and the well-being of these self-employed women when they receive this benefit? What we find is that household income, despite their lower business revenue, is going to increase. Why is this? Because the benefit is going to more than compensate for the loss of revenues and income. So part of it, it's a partial substitution for work with this benefit. We find little impact on household composition, and due to our data, we can also study the health of the eligible mothers, but we also find little impact on maternal health, let it be mental health or physical health. So given our findings, let me just pause in case there are some questions here. All right, so feel free, of course, to write any questions in the chat, and Fabrizio is going to either answer them or pass them to me. All right, so given our findings on the revenue and the income of self-employed women we study, the next set of questions asked is what do they do with once they work less? Whether they take care, for example, more of their children. What do we find is that children of eligible mothers, so those who can receive this cash benefit, are 9% less likely to attend any formal daycare. So we interpret this in a way that at least part of this reduction in labor supply, self-employed mothers are going to use to care for their children. What happens next is once we see this effect on labor supply and on taking care of children or daycare more precisely, we are also very curious about whether this has an effect on child outcomes. Why is so? Because the goal of this policy was particularly to help the well-being of mothers and children. So regarding child outcome and child well-being, we are going to study health outcomes, physical health particularly. And what we find is a reduction of about 15% in total health costs and the lower use of medication in the first year after birth. We show that these type of medications, when there's a lower use, are mostly medications that are associated with daycare use. So medicines, for example, against skin infections. What we do next at the end of the paper is that although we find a positive effect on health in the short run, we also look at the medium and longer run outcomes. So we are going to follow up children of eligible mothers up to the age of 6. And very interestingly, what we find is that there's a reversal. So although their health is going to be better in the first year after birth, in the long run, so particularly at age 3 and 4, their health is going to be a little bit worse. On the average, on the whole period of 6 years, we don't find any difference in health. So it seems there's a reversal, and the health consequences of the policy in this sense are a little bit unclear. All right, let me present if there are no questions here. I see there's a question in the chat. I don't know if Fabrizio is handling it. Very good. So let me talk a little bit about the contribution before I go into the details, how we think of our paper. Well, the first literature, and possibly this is the closest literature to the interest of this group, is on entrepreneurship and childbirth. So most of this work is focused on the extensive margin. For example, how access to abortion or different maternal care policies affect transition into self-employment. What we do instead, we are going to focus on incumbent self-employed mothers, and we study how motherhood affects these mothers, and we also evaluate a maternity benefit. So we really see our contribution as evaluating this benefit and looking at the effect on mothers and children. Possibly closest to our work is an excellent job market paper by Valentina Rotigliano, who studies the child penalty also for entrepreneurs. So compared to her excellent work, we focus a little bit more on this evaluation of the maternity benefit. Now, our work also relates to, of course, a very large labor and health literature. So regarding labor, there are various papers that study the effects of maternity benefits on maternal labor supply. What is observed in this literature is that most maternity benefits affect both the income of the mothers, but also job protection. So whether they can return to their previous job once they completed their maternity leave. So it's very difficult in general to come upon a policy that purely affects the income of mothers. So one example is the work of Cristina Borra and co-authors who study a cash benefit in Spain So this cash benefit is going to be very similar to the cash benefit that we study in magnitude. However, our contribution is to study self-employed individuals instead of employees. And this is going to be an important difference because Bora and co-authors, for example, they don't find any labor market effects. So maternal labor supply is not affected by this additional income, whereas in our setup, we are going to find an effect on labor supply, and consequently, we are also going to find an effect on child health. But let me skip the third part of literature for the sake of time and move on to the study design. So what kind of data allows us to identify the effects of motherhood and the maternity benefit on self-employed women? First of all, we are going to have data on the quarterly revenue of all self-employed women and the entrepreneurs in the Netherlands from VAT, so value-added tax declarations. We are going to focus on revenues primarily instead of income or earnings, because we believe that revenues are more strongly correlated with the actual hours worked, for example, because they are not affected by fixed cost, and because they are also available both for incorporated and unincorporated form of entrepreneurs. So we can study them at the same time. We also have data on annual personal and household income, demographic characteristics, including household composition, whether there's a partner or there are other children. And very importantly for our health evaluation, we have data on annual health cost of both mothers and also their children. So you have to imagine the health system in the Netherlands is universal healthcare. So there are not going to be incentives. For example, if I don't work, I don't have health insurance, or I cannot use the health system. So there are no such financial incentives. And we can observe all type of health costs, for example, general practitioner cost or hospitalization cost for both mothers and children. We also have annual binary indicators for the use of medicines grouped by the so-called ATC classification. You can think of this, for example, that the J01 code represents antibiotics. So we can go a little bit more into detail about health diagnosis. How does our sample look like? So we studied 2,451 women who gave birth between February and September 2008, who had a business incorporated on the 1st of January of that year. And we are going to focus initially on smaller entrepreneurs or smaller self-employed businesses that had no more than 100,000 euros in revenue in 2007 and that had non-negative profits. This is because the cash benefit is unconditional on income and it's a single amount of 5,000 euros. So it has the strongest effect for this group. Entrepreneurs or self-employed women in our sample have a mean revenue of about 38,000 euros, a profit of 22,000 euros in 2007. Now, just to put this a little bit in reference, the minimum wage in that year was 17,000 euros. So they earn a little bit above minimum wage, but they are not high earners in general. We also have a classification whether these people are entrepreneurs in a sense that they have employees, or they have an incorporated business, or they have some tangible assets on the balance sheet of their business. In this classification, about 55% of our sample can be considered as employees. Frequent industries include retail, for example, hair care, beauty salons, but there are also medical practitioners or consultants, business educators, or driving instructors. So it's a fairly diverse sample of self-employed women. So let me focus today, as I mentioned, on the results on the maternity cash benefits and mostly on the impact on revenue, daycare use, and maternal and child health. The reform we are going to exploit is called ZES. This is a maternity cash benefit that was introduced in 2008 in the Netherlands for self-employed women. And the goal of this benefit is to protect the health of mother and child. Now, what you have to know about the benefit is that it lasts in general 16 weeks. It starts 6 to 4 weeks before the pregnancy due date. and last 10 to 12 weeks after childbirth. The amount of the benefit is 5,000 euros if the mother worked at least 1,225 hours or about 24 hours per week in the previous year, in 2007. What is nice in this setup for identification is that there was no anticipation of this benefit. So the bill that introduced the benefit was submitted at the end of February in 2008 and was accepted in April 22, 2008. So the pregnancies we are going to study, the births are between February and September 2008. So these mothers couldn't time their pregnancy in this sense because the benefit was not yet known. There's also a clear date cutoff of eligibility. So self-employed mothers are eligible if and only if they give birth on or after June 4th. So we are going to use month after June's as our treated months where mothers are eligible, and months before June as our control months where mothers are not eligible. Let me show you some summary statistics of the two groups, so June to September births and February to May births. What you can see that in both groups, the two set of self-employed women are very similar. Their age is about 33 and a half year old. Some of them actually already had one child before, so our sample is going to include both women who are giving birth to their first child, but also women who already had some children before giving birth in our sample period. They are similar in business revenue, business income, personal income, and gross household income as well. All right, so to the results and identification, the first thing we are going to do is look at how quarterly revenues are affected by being eligible for this benefit. So as I mentioned, we are going to compare birth between February and May and June, September in 2008. And we are going to estimate the following model. We look at the revenue of the self-employed woman, mother. We have individual fixed effects, alpha I. We have an indicator for being in the post period, so after birth or starting from the quarter of the birth. And we have this indicator interacted with being eligible, so giving birth in the June to September period. We also have a set of fixed effects. So these are quarter time dummies interacted with the age of the self-employed women, the number of children before giving birth, and the industry. So practically, we are comparing women in the same industry giving birth a little bit later or a little bit earlier. What is nice in using quarterly data is that we can shift. So we can calculate the relative quarters since birth. Our sample is also going to include a set of self-employed women who didn't give birth in this period, and their role is mostly to identify these quarter dummies, so identify the time trends that are valid for all self-employed women in this period. What do we find? Here's first, I'm going to show you diff and diff effects, so just comparing before birth revenues to after birth revenues. And what we find is that those women who are eligible for this 5,000 euro benefit, they are going to reduce their quarterly revenues by about 740 euros. And what you can see in the second and the third column, so the second column studies the extensive margin, whether they have any revenues, and the third column studies the intensive margin in logs. What we can see is that most or all of this reduction is on the intensive margin. So eligible women work less in this period after birth. How does it look like dynamically? So in the previous table, I showed you the first 2 years. In this chart, what you can see is the x-axis are the quarters since birth. So 0 is the quarter of the birth. And the y-axis, these are the log outcomes. So you can see this percentage change relative to the baseline, which is -2, so 2 quarters before birth. And what you can see is that the trend, although we acknowledge it's a noisy chart, the trend between those who are eligible and non-eligible are very similar before birth. However, after birth, in the next 2 years, those mothers who are eligible for this benefit, they are going to earn lower revenues. what you can also see is that starting from the 8th quarter, so roughly the end of the second year, this difference is going to disappear. So to summarize these findings, there's a negative effect on revenues in the first 2 years. However, this is not a long-term effect. Later on, this difference is going to close. We also implement a placebo test. So you might be worried that, all right, we are comparing earlier and later births. They might not be perfectly similar. In our placebo test, we look at the same setup, but in 2009 and 2010, when there was no change on benefit. So all mothers were eligible for the benefit in these years. And in these years, we don't find any difference between earlier and later births. All right, so given the effects of revenues, we move forward and we also look at income, because we don't only care about how much mothers work or how much their revenues, but we also care about what's the effect on their income and their household income. Now, estimating the effects of annual outcomes, such as income or health, is a little bit more complicated, because what we could do with revenues, we could shift, as I explained, to quarters. So we could calculate the relative quarters since birth. However, when we use annual data, we cannot do this. So imagine we are comparing a mother who gives birth in September with a mother who gives birth in February. Now, of course, the mother who gave birth in February had their child for a much longer period in 2008. So this is not a fair comparison, because motherhood affects, obviously, business revenues and income. So instead of doing this simple comparison, diff and diff, we are also bringing in the group who gave birth in 2009. So we are going to difference out any difference between earlier and later births using a year 2009 when everybody is treated, everybody was eligible for the benefit. We estimate the following diff and diff model in this case. So now we are in annual data. So YIT is, for example, the annual income of mother I for year T, calendar year T. We are going to look, S is the relative year. So we will look at 3 years before birth until 3 years after birth. We again have a set of control variables, which are specific to that relative year. So these are the industry of the mother, the age of the mother, and the number of children before birth. Capital E is now an indicator of giving birth, being eligible, so giving birth in the June to September period compared to the February to May period. B 2008 is birth 2008 is an indicator of giving birth in 2008 compared to 2009. And what we are interested is in a diff and diff in the interaction term. So giving birth in the eligible period in 2008. These are our treatment effects. So the sample is going to include self-employed women on the 1st of January of 2008 or 2009, and as I mentioned, who gave birth between February and September of these years. What do we find on business income and other annual outcomes? The first thing we look is business income. So here we look at unincorporated self-employed women. They are about 91% of our sample. And what we find is that the year before births, their trend, although they are fairly noisy, they are not significantly different from each other. However, in the year of the birth, those mothers who are eligible for this 5,000 euro benefit, they have about 1,800 euro lower business income. In the next year, in BE +1, birth year +1, they still have about 1,300 euro lower business income. Now, how does this compare to the benefit? We estimate with a take-up rate of the benefit about 80%. We estimate that this 1,800 euros is about half of the benefit amount. So they receive the benefit, they work less, they have a lower income. However, they do not work as much less as the benefit amount. So part of the benefit, actually, is going to increase their personal income, which is the sum of their business income and the benefit amount. So you can see here the effects both in euros and in logs. So in logs, this is about a 20% higher personal income. We also study their partners. So you might think that maybe their partner also works less because the mother starts taking care more of the child. We do not find a strong effect on partner. And overall, with the positive effect on the personal income of the mother, no effect on the partner, we are going to find an about 6.5% increase in household income. All right, so a little bit work less, earn lower income, but household income still increases. So when we move to the health shock, think about these kind of composite effects. What we also find is that eligible women save at least part of this benefit because we see that their bank account growth rate increases. So it seems that they do not immediately use this benefit. They might save it later for either precautionary purposes or for other purposes. What do self-employed women do with their time? So we do not have precise data on time use. However, what we can observe in data is daycare use. So in the Netherlands, daycare is subsidized. And from this subsidy data, we can back out how much daycare each child uses. What we can see in our results, so again, I highlighted the first row. This is the interaction term of being eligible for the benefit, so giving birth between June and September, and giving birth in 2008. So this is our treatment effect. What we find is that the children of eligible women, they are less likely to go to daycare. So in total, annually, they use daycare about 60 hours less. If you see the mean at the bottom of the table, this is 642 hours. So this is roughly a little bit less than a 10% effect in hours. And most of this effect, actually, or more, all of this effect is going to come from the extensive margin. So the second column is the extensive margin, and the third column is the intensive margin. So eligible women use less daycare. Their child use less daycare. This effect is actually going to be much stronger for so-called daycare centers. So these are big, less flexible daycare centers where they cannot adjust the schedules so easily to their working time. Whereas if you look at so-called child minors, which you have to imagine more like babysitters who look after up to six children, there might be even a mild positive effect, but this is not statistically significant. All right, so to summarize, we see negative effects on revenues and negative effect on daycare. Now, does the cash benefit also affect the well-being of mothers? And when we talk about well-being, what we can very well measure is health. So the first thing we are going to look at is the antidepressant use, whether it affects the depression rate among self-employed mothers. However, we do not find any strong effect. So being eligible for this benefit in our data, where antidepressants are measured as a binary variable, have no effect on depression. It might be, that on the intensive margin, they have effects. However, our data only allow us to measure a binary indicator for antidepressant use. We also look at health costs of the mothers. There we also don't find a very strong effect, a statistically significant effect. Neither do find effects on the number of children or having a partner. So all in all, what we can say about the effects of receiving this money is that it has no clear effects of maternal well-being along these dimensions. However, what we find are strong effects on the well-being, or particularly the health of the child. So how could these maternity benefits affect the health of the child? Let me just go through some channels before showing the results. So the first thing that could happen is that, well, maternity cash benefits, they could reduce the parental stress and lead to better parenting. For example, think about fewer conflicts or divorce. However, if I go back to our previous table I just shown you, this is not affected in our data, right? So we didn't find an effect on depression. We didn't find an effect on divorces, for example. So this theory is not supported by the available data to us. The second channel that's possible is that the cash benefit, remember, it increases the household income by 6.5%. So it could be that these material resources, they might allow self-employed mothers to purchase, for example, better food, or they give them more parental time. They can also allow them to breastfeed longer. So these channels are certainly possible, and they are documented in the health literature. However, our data doesn't really allow us. So we do not have direct measures of food quality, for example, or breastfeeding. What we did is a back of the envelope exercise. We looked at how parental income affects the health cost of children. So this is purely a correlation. And what we find that about 4,000 euro higher parental income lowers child health costs by about 1%. Now, what I'm going to show you about child health is a 15% reduction, 14, 15%. So it seems this is a small part of the story. What is much more likely, and what we are going to argue for, is this is due to decreased daycare use and the decreased exposure to transmittable diseases. So let me show you our results about child health. We are going to document child health along two dimensions. The first is health costs. So health costs are going to include GP, so general practitioner costs, but also medicine costs and specialist care costs. What do we find? Again, here the interesting row is the first one, so giving birth in the eligible period times the 2008 dummy. What we find is that the children of eligible mothers, they have about 15%, these are in logs, 16 points, lower health costs. Or if we measure it in euros, this is about 105 euros per year. To give you a perspective, in the control group, you can see at the bottom of the table that the mean health costs are about 600 euros at this age. So let me add, sorry, that all these results I present now are for the first year after birth. So children who are born in 2008, these are the results for 2009. So where do these health cost reductions come? One part is going to come from GP consultations. So they are less likely to go to the general practitioner. But if you look at columns 3 and 4, in column 3, you see that in euros, this is 2.5 euros, not significant. This is going to be a small reduction. Why is this? Because GP consultations are relatively cheap. So strong effect on GP consultations, but this is not driving the cost reductions. We also find some negative effects on medicine costs. However, these are not statistically significant, whereas most of the cost reductions are going to come from specialist care cost. And particularly, as you can see in column 8, this is on the extensive margin. So children of eligible women, they are less likely to go to specialists. Who is a specialist is a pediatrician in the Netherlands, for example. So don't think of these as these children are less diagnosed with cancer or other terrible serious conditions. So what we find that these specialist care costs are mostly related to consultations. We do not have exact diagnosis, but what we can see is that in this age group, most of these specialist care consultations relate, for example, to throat infections or different viral infections. To dig a little bit deeper into what's going on health-wise, we also look at medications. And what we find is that, first of all, as you see in the first column, the number of different medications that these children use also drop. So this is just a rough measure of health. So along another dimension, we see that health improves. And what you see in the next 4 columns are different. We are going to study 8 different medication classes that are the most frequently used at the age of 1. And without going into too much details, what we find is that it's mostly medications affected that are linked to some sort of transmittable diseases and mostly skin conditions. So think about fungal infections, for example. And the final column, the JO1, these are antibacterial, so antibiotics. So what we find overall, and that these are diseases, and what we see in the medical literature, that these are diseases that are strongly linked to daycare use. So these results suggest that these children are less likely to go to daycare and they suffer less from daycare-caused illnesses. To end my talk, let me show you a little bit of a long-term perspective. So what you can see on this graph is the long-term health effects on child health, on both log health costs and the number of medicines used. What's particularly interesting is that although we find a negative effect in the first year, there seemed to be a positive effect, so worsening of health in years 3 and 4, and in the long run, we do not find any effects. So this is consistent with the so-called hygiene hypothesis, meaning that children who do not go to daycare at an early age, they have a better health, but they do not build up immunity and they suffer from more illnesses when they enter school. All right, we also complete some robustness tests. Let me skip for the sake of time, and let me conclude. So what we do this paper is we ask two sets of questions. The first, how does childbirth affect the revenue of self-employed women? I did not show you much today on this for the sake of time, but what we document is that self-employed women face a similar child penalty as employed women, whereas we do not find effects of childbirth among self-employed men. The second set of questions we study is what are the impacts of giving a maternity benefit for self-employed women. What we find is a reduction in business revenue, but only during the first 2 years, not in the long run. We also see a substitution effect, so household income is going to increase, so it's a partial substitution of cash benefit for business income. We see that the benefit reduces the use of formal daycare, that the health of the mother is unaffected, and that child health improves, but not in the long run. So let me conclude. What does this mean for the effect of a maternity benefit for this group? So the effects are not perfectly clear. We find no health effects in the overall. However, the literature also documents positive effects on cognitive scores or long-term effects. So this leaves us with an open question on the efficiency of this policy. All right, thank you so much for the attention and your questions on the chat. And thanks, Fabrizio, for your answers on the chat.
Wonderful, perfect timing. Thank you, Daniel. We're going to hand it over to Elena for her discussion, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end.
Excellent. I guess you can see my screen. Thank you very much for having me today discuss this paper. I guess I enjoyed reading the paper. I enjoyed the presentation even more. So an impromptu comment is that, you know, the paper and the introduction should follow that presentation. And maybe it is now, but not in the, you know, the draft I read. But I really like the motivation in the presentation much more. So I would like to sort of start with a big picture, which is, you know, why should we even care about these topics? And let me share some facts. I think we all understand that we want sort of to increase labor supply for women. Labor force participation rates for women have been lagging those of men. And even, you know, though we've seen sort of progress, as this plot shows, over the last 40 to 50 years, there is still a significant gap between the two. Number two, we know that women do not choose high-paying occupations in the economy, or at least traditionally. So there's a very nice paper by she and co-authors who say that women face occupational barriers due to several frictions, and childcare is one of those frictions. And that is very costly on aggregate. So occupational barriers, they show, leads to this talent misallocation in the economy, and that hurts aggregate productivity. And over time, as you know, these occupational barriers have reduced, and we see more women lawyers, more women doctors, etc. This has really, you know, increased aggregate output. So this is a key question for economy-wide trends as well. And so the elephant is the room in this question, sort of A, increase labor supply, B, sort of, you know, reduce these occupational barriers for women is childcare. And, you know, as Daniel discussed as well, we know in the literature there is a high penalty associated with having children. Clevin has a lot of work on this, but in one of his papers, he estimates the child penalty per country. And he shows that this is substantial. These plots show the employment rates for men and women. The gray line is men, the black line is women following the birth of the first child. And you see that there is a significant gap. And this is true both in the United States as well as in Netherlands, and it's true for every country in the Western world. And so where that brings us Well, what are the policy to fix this? What are the policy to encourage women to participate in the labor market? What is the policy to encourage women to, go for more demanding careers? That would sort of then also allow them to, earn more money and reduce the gender pay gaps and all that. There is a large literature on these questions. And so the question is there room for more? And I will argue that there is. First of all, because not all policies have the same effects. And so what is the right policy to achieve these outcomes out there? I think this is very much an open question. For example, does the policy take the form of a cash benefit that is directly provided to the household, as in this paper, or it's time of work, as in, or increased childcare center supply? Also, there have been big shifts in social norms over time. There are many differences across countries. So here, external validity is a big issue. And so I am in favor of a multifaceted approach where, we study a lot of these things to sort of reach safer conclusions in terms of what works and what doesn't. The advantage of this paper also is that it has a very novel focus, which is that it focuses on female entrepreneurs, maybe a bit of a stretch but self-employed women. And as Daniel explained, although most existing papers focus on becoming an entrepreneur, what is the effect of policies on women entering entrepreneurship? There is less known about the effect of childcare benefits on existing small businesses, which is the focus of this paper, and I think this is very nice. And so very quickly, we see the paper studies the introduction of this flat rate cash benefit for self-employed women in the Netherlands. And in a nutshell, the policy resulted in these eligible self-employed women growing their businesses less, but this is a very much short-run effect. There is no persistent effect in the long run. And we saw some positive effects on children health, again in the short run, and no effect on maternal mental health. So my first comment will relate to, again, this idea that the policy design in this context matters a lot. I read the paper and I thought, oh, this is very interesting, because what they find is in sharp contrast in the surface from my findings, in our paper with Ting and Sheng, where we show that in the context of Canada, when the government provided a childcare subsidy to families, there is actually a positive effect on labor supply. There's actually a positive effect on women earnings, and we see women choosing more demanding careers. But then, there's a key difference between our paper and this one, which is that in the case of Canada, the families would not directly receive the subsidy. They would only benefit from the subsidy if they were to enroll their children to the daycare center. So it was the daycare center who was receiving the subsidy from the government. And this is very different from this paper, where the benefit takes the form of a cash transfer to new mothers. And I think the findings in this paper are very much consistent with this idea that positive liquidity shocks tend to reduce individuals' labor supply or job search efforts. And this is a well-known result in the literature. I think the findings in this paper are very much consistent with this idea. And so then my next comment relates to, do I find the results surprising, and where should we take the paper from here? As Daniel explained very well, the policy focuses on self-employed business owners. 90% of the sample are unincorporated self-employed mothers. And I want to say, although this is not in the paper, that the majority of those will be part-time unincorporated self-employed mothers. And why is that? Because according to the paper, to be fully eligible for the subsidy, you have to have at least 30 full-time work weeks. And so, you can be working part-time and you're still fully eligible for the subsidy. So what do we know about unincorporated self-employed workers? And this is mostly from the US, but I guess it's similar. They tend to have volatile earnings. Self-employment is often used as a bridge between spells of employment. They're more likely to be less educated women who tend to actually have young children under 6 years old, presumably in the absence of childcare options. And these are the women who have a preference for flexible work arrangements. In fact, there's a very nice paper by Lim that estimates how much mothers with preschool-aged children value this package of flexible amenities in self-employment, and she estimates that it is substantial. And so, in other words, policy targets workers who precisely self-select into a flexible part-time work arrangement in order to spend time with their children. This is what they wanted all along. And so to me, it's not very surprising that, when you give these women sort of, cash from the government, they shift their time allocation away from labor supply and towards taking care of their children in the short run, meaning while they're receiving the subsidy. So this substitution between business income and government provided cash benefits is happening for just this 1 year while they receive the subsidy from the government. So I didn't find that very surprising, but I would be very interested to know, what do new mothers do with the extra cash? And I think that, I'm not sure actually right now from the findings in the paper. Daniel showed a significant and positive effect on the banking account, but again, they sort of look, I think, 2 years out. And maybe, these new mothers are still taking care of the children, while they're young, but eventually they will use this money to perhaps start a new business, invest in their human capital by going back to the university, invest in their existing business. Do we see, for example, these businesses becoming incorporated in the long run? And so my point is that I think that we need to expand the sample and allow for a longer window to fully evaluate the effect of this policy. And I think that would be super interesting to do. The other big result in the paper is the effect on mothers' mental health. And there was a null result. So, and I found that very surprising. So ex ante, I would have expected that, now these mothers can actually take care of their babies without stressing out about sort of, extra income. And I would have expected to see a positive effect. Now, maybe it is that, it is actually healthy for women to take their minds away from a baby for a few hours and work. And maybe that explains the null effect. Or it could be that again, the measure is not appropriate for this question. And let me explain why. I don't know this, but I would imagine that, women avoid taking any medication while breastfeeding or even during pregnancy. And so it could be that there is very limited variation in that measure that doesn't allow you to find significant results here. Or because you do sort of focus on the extensive margin, it could be the case that those that are on antidepressants cannot stop. They've been on antidepressants during pregnancy, during breastfeeding period. Maybe it's very hard for them to stop, and that's why you don't actually see any effect. And again, I didn't know that you don't observe data on the intensive margin, but I think with that measure, the intensive margin would have been much more informative. In the paper, I'm not sure if I saw it today, there was also this result on fertility decisions where there are no sort of results, no significant results 2 years later. But again, to me, that was a very short window sort of to evaluate whether, they will have subsequent kids sort of 2 years after they just gave birth. And so I think, again, is the same point of we need more data and more time to evaluate the full effect of this policy. And finally, there's an interesting result on children's health. I think this very nice plot you showed in the end was not in the version of the paper that I read. So my comment was exactly what you said, that there is a positive effect on children's health in the short run, but this will be reversed once they start daycare, start school, and they are in a group setting. In fact, I have more sites for you from some literature, medical publications in JAMA Pediatrics, where exactly they find that once kids go to school, then they will get sick. And then, when you get sick, actually doesn't predict more negative sort of health outcomes. So babies, you know, if you get sick more as a baby versus when you get older, that doesn't matter in the long run. And so I think I am right on time. So let me just conclude, which is that, you know, I guess the big question is that policy working? Is it good or bad? And I think after reading the paper, it was rather unclear to me. What I learned was that there was a short-term sort of negative effect on business revenue, but there was no long-term impact. There was no effect on, so it didn't help mothers in terms of, you know, sort of improving their mental health. And again, the positive effect on children is reversible in the longer run. But I think that there are still several open questions. And I think to fully answer these questions, it would require expanding the window that would allow you to look at longer-term business outcomes for eligible mothers, longer-term children outcomes, longer-term family outcomes. I mean, you talked about divorce again, maybe 2 years out is too soon to see this effect. I think you could sort of inform us much more with sort of a more long-term analysis of the policy. Thank you very much.